Ladies and gentlemen, this is Envoy of Kairos back for another Speedpaint. I know I'm uploading this one a day late, but it was a hefty piece. I've stated before, especially in my Sonic commission. Well, actually, no, that wasn't a commission. That was my anniversary tribute piece. But, yeah, that one, I repeatedly stated that I'm not the best at backgrounds, I'm not the most experienced, and I needed a lot of practice with it. My buddy Nate decided to test me and make sure I get some good practice with it by giving me this commission for an interesting set piece for a D&D campaign he's running. What he wanted overall was a Victorian-style tunnel that's a little old, a little run down. Some relatively advanced machinery for Dungeons & Dragons setting tucked away within. A lot of people don't quite realize how advanced technology in Dungeons & Dragons actually is, largely because it's still martial combat and swords and bows and such. But they still have guns and airships, so there's plenty. And that's not even counting the Warforged. But the overall concept was something pretty sound and gave me a chance to restore some of my experience and skills with your standard vanishing point pieces, and doing it with an off perspective of a tunnel that appropriately shows both walls felt like a pretty good approach. Now, not to say I did it perfectly, but I think I managed to restore my knowledge of that particular technique, and it turned out pretty good. The most impressive thing, though, is certainly not the architecture, but how I managed with the texture and lighting and shading. Now, it's supposed to be a relatively simple but layered piece with multiple different variants for him to switch throughout as the campaign goes on. Essentially, while playing out the campaign, he starts with the initial fully lit piece, and then goes on to the dimmer one, then the monster-infested one, and eventually the boss variant you'll see at the end. Of course, I started with the fully lit variant, and then threw on all of the shading and the monsters afterwards. I made sure to, as per his instructions, make sure the monsters were vague and heavily silhouetted and shadowed, so that their exact nature wasn't obvious at a glance. But there's a few other tricks that I slipped into this piece that were entirely of my own design. For one, there's some carvings that are faded and barely noticeable on the pillars that are a pretty big hint as to the nature of the enemies in this dungeon. Then there's also the designs of the lamps, where if you look closely, you'll notice some pretty interesting signs as to their nature. You see, the main enemy that he chose for this location turned out to be a massive artificer-designed clockwork spider that in itself became a factory for other clockwork spiders. And then those spiders would go out and collect materials from abandoned machinery and whatever armor and weapons that wayward adventurers would leave when they wandered in and died, or were actively killed by its minions. And all of that metal would be repurposed to create more spiders. There will be multiple variants in this dungeon, two of which I suggested, and he absolutely loved. One of them is actually hidden in this image. It's the lanterns. Close enough look, and you'll notice that some of the details look quite spider-like. That would be a specialized version that's meant to hide in the scenery and then slowly descend down their metal threads then grab onto your back or your head and shock and grasp you. Living traps are always fun. I think that's why so many DMs absolutely love mimics. But having ones that take on very different forms makes things a lot more interesting. So, moving on from there, the color scheme and such was largely drawn from classic Victorian architecture. A lot of brownish stones and granite, particularly. But it's also carved out from an existing mountain tunnel and expanded, and the floors and ceiling are largely raw stone that's just been smoothed down. The holes in the wall then reveal some of the machinery involved in this place. If you're going to have a lot of clockwork enemies and an artificer's lab, you're going to need some power sources, and of course their technology is going to invade the rest of the place quite easily. So the walls are oft hollow, but contain a myriad of machinery and largely cogs and pipes connecting them. Many of the cogs for machines that the lead spider saw as unnecessary were eventually disassembled and collected to be used to produce more spiders, of course. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. Lighting and texturing a setting like this, the texturing was definitely the most difficult and obnoxious part, but sadly, the difficulty of it caused some technical difficulties for me. Basically, one of my attempts at texturing it caused a bit of basically Photoshop lagged a lot, and a couple other programs I had out at the time crashed while the whole computer had a bit of a hiccup. So I actually lost and corrupted the footage of my Photoshop session in which I textured the vast majority of this. But to give you a general rundown, the granite texture, I did source a photo texture for the base of it, but then I added my own additional grain, blurred it largely, and of course I had to alter the perspective drastically along each wall and do multiple layers of it for the sides and faces of the pillars. But despite the sourcing, I'd say the originality of it turned out quite well. The stone texture also had a source, but it was kind of a generic one I had to repeatedly mirror and manipulate to generate something a little more organic. And then, of course, blurring and smudging it around a bit in order to create some different curves and edges. It's subtle because the stone is supposed to be largely smoothed out, but there will always be a couple of little ridges that are raised here and there. But then when it comes to the metal and wood textures, I'm very experienced with creating those 100% organically. It's largely the same technique for the two. It's very heavily dependent on different scales of motion blur. It's just that the metal texture is more refined and uses a much wider range blur, while the wood texture uses a much shorter one to create more noticeable grains. Applying them all was relatively simple, just creating a large-scale texture and then mapping it over each individual piece and deleting all of the parts that were unnecessary. I ended up taking some slightly different methods with the production of this one. I'm trying to expand my repertoire of techniques. And the base color for the image, instead of being a few dozen different layers, ended up being one entire collaborative layer. which made the shading, texturing, and lighting process quite different, but I kinda like this method. It'll really depend on what I'm producing, but overall, I think it turned out pretty well. Then, of course, we get down to the creation of the monsters at the end of this piece, and they're largely vague silhouettes that are then shrouded in shadow that I heavily blurred, layered, and smudged to make them generally creepier and more difficult to discern exactly what they are besides their general body type. And then, of course, there's the multiple extra layers of shadowing, which, the additional darkness, I think, worked pretty well. I used multiple colors for generally shading it, working my way from some more notable saturated navies all the way out to solid black. But the gradient becomes more noticeable in the boss version, in which I get rid of the humanoid entities, keep the two mechanical spiders, and then add the gigantic eyes of the boss spider far in the background. I also lowered the lamp in the foreground and electrified it to reveal some of its nature as a shocking grasp-wielding mechanical spider. Overall, I feel like the lighting and shading made the greatest difference in this piece, far more than the texturing, but there wouldn't be quite as much depth to the lighting and shading if not for the texturing. So, overall, it's a pretty complex piece despite how simply it's designed. But I'm happy with it, my customer is incredibly happy with it, and I hope it gets a couple of good reactions out of his D&D campaign party. So, what should they expect of this place? Well, this tunnel used to be wielded by many smugglers and criminals of all kinds throughout the kingdom. Once used by dwarven miners employed by the kingdom to seek out the rarest jewels within this mountain. Eventually, the mine ran dry and was abandoned, and smugglers began to use it to hide their greatest stores. Criminals would hide out in the deep crevices, waiting for law enforcement to run themselves ragged searching. But one grand artificer's creation waits in the back, eventually growing tired of the stagnation, reactivating its factory components to produce and produce unendingly. Any who wander into this place are sure to become its victims. Well, I think that's enough for now. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Envoy of Kairos signing out. And I'll see you all again in just under 2 weeks for another Speedpaint. The next one is well underway, so it shouldn't be late. Later, guys. Hey, thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, then be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're looking to support me a little further, maybe get some bonus content or just keep up with me and other fans, you can find links down in the description leading to my Patreon, my Discord, and my Twitter. And if you're following me on Patreon, then you can expect some content polls to decide what's coming up on the channel, yet a little bit of background additions to some other series I've been working on, some more original and creative stuff. And who knows, if enough of you start supporting me soon, I might have a few other surprises up my sleeve too. Again, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all again on the next video.